This is the Hofstra Radio Alumni Audio Yearbook. Today is March 3rd, 2025. Please tell us your name and the years you were at Hofstra Radio.
My name's Evan Wilner, and I was with Hofstra Radio from 2004 until 2007.
Okay. And what shows or programs did you work on at the station?
I mostly worked in the sports department, so the locker room, the news line. I remember the first time I was on air was Rock and Roll Oasis, and then I was a big part of the Hofstra Morning Wake Up Call, doing sports, but also joining in on the conversation and being part of the cast of characters of people who talked on air during the Hofstra Morning Wake Up Call. But mostly the things I did were in the sports department, games, and the locker room.
Got it. Did you have any titles or positions at the station?
I was the assistant sports director and the locker room producer from January 2006 to December 2006. And I also produced a show called In the Trenches that covered not only Hofstra football, but at the time, Colonial Athletic Association, when we still had a football team. We covered the entire conference, and I produced that show as well.
Okay, cool. When you were on the air, did you have any nicknames or on-air personas?
No, I kind of kept it pretty formal, especially, in the sports department. So I didn't have any nicknames or anything like that.
All right. Very good. I like to start off with a two-part question, and however it makes sense to you to answer, just go with that. But I always want to know what brought people to the station to begin with, and then if you could describe what it was like when you got there. For those of us who weren't there at the same time, what did the place look like? What did it smell like? Do you remember any of the people that you met when you first showed up?
Yeah, the thing that brought me to Hofstra and to WRHU were both Kevin and Ed Ingles. Ed was a family friend, and because of Ed and my uncle actually working together at CBS Radio, I would go to different events with my uncle, and I'd run into Kevin Ingles, and we were around the same age. He was a little older than me, and the two of them were the reason I kind of just started looking at Hofstra as a school, and then they're the reason I went there and joined RSU. I remember I was on a visit to Hofstra my senior year of high school. My dad was a sports writer, and he was covering the Jets, and I just went out with him one day, and while he was working, I scheduled a tour of Hofstra, not just WRHU, but the whole campus. And in the middle of the tour, Kevin Ingles saw me and pulled me off the tour and said something along the lines of, you're not going to learn what you need to learn on this tour. Come with me." And he brings me to WRHU, and I was blown away by the facilities, the equipment, how professional it looked. And then he brought me to his dad's office. I talked to Ed for a few minutes, and immediately Ed had a plan for me of, if you come to Hofstra, here's what it looks like. You're going to do games, and we don't have a commercial radio station that does games. So the students do all of the games. You're going to travel here and travel there. You're going to be the sports director or the assistant sports director by your junior year. And he had mapped out this entire plan for me in 5 minutes.
Wow.
And then he took me in the studio. I watched Newsline, and it was like watching a professional broadcast take the air, the way people prepared, the way people spoke on the air. And immediately after, 10 minutes, I knew this is where I wanted to go to school, and this is what it could do, for my career. I knew right away going to Hofstra could give me a jump start on any career in radio, because you just look around and you're getting, for me, I was transferring in, so it was 3 years. Like, you're getting 3 years of professional radio development. And that's the reason that I went to Hofstra.
Wow. That's amazing. So many questions. I'm trying to keep track of them all. One of the things that I like to ask when people talk about Ed Ingles, because I didn't know the man personally, I just knew him by reputation and by his broadcast work. But this is kind of an odd question, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I usually ask it. Did you know? I mean, you knew who Ed was, but did you know Ed as a broadcaster? Did you know he was such a big deal?
I didn't know that he had called the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
It wasn't until I was at Hofstra, and it was probably maybe in the training class or right out of it, but he was talking to me about preparing for a broadcast, and he said, when I hadn't called football on the radio in a long time, and I get a call from CBS and they want me to call the Super Bowl. And he's like, so I went into a room and I just started practicing football play by play on the radio. And, he's like, I didn't care about the names. That wasn't important. It was just all about telling the story and the geography of it. And that was the first time I had learned of like how big he actually was. Like
Mm-hmm.
I knew him when he was covering, the Westchester Golf Tournament, the Buick Classic, and I knew him from, working at WCBS locally, but I had no idea that he had this national career of doing play by play and the Super Bowl. So no, even though I knew who he was and I had a familiarity with his career, I didn't know how far back it went and how big he was at one point.
Yeah. Oh, that's neat to hear that even though you had this relationship and through family and you knew who he was as a broadcaster, that you still learned more. And just a casual aside, like when I got to call the Super Bowl, that he wasn't doing it to show off. He was trying to give you perspective and give you some advice. And I love hearing those stories. So thank you for indulging me there. And I imagine, like you said, going back to that first conversation where you said, "Here's your plan." I guess my follow up question there is, did you trust him because he was a family friend, or did you trust him because you knew he was a professional broadcaster who had a really good idea of how the system works?
It was a little bit of both. Obviously, I knew I could trust him because of the family connection, but it was also just how detailed he was in the plan, and that he's not gonna just think about this plan and tell it to anyone, right? Like he's gonna tell that plan because he believes in you. And I think
Yeah.
that's the big thing that I learned early on, not only from Ed but from Bruce Avery and John Mullen, is these people really believed in you and
Hmm.
they would go out of their way to give you that confidence in yourself. And I think that was the big thing that I took away from that initial conversation with Ed. And then, when I eventually went to Hofstra, like I said, I ended up going to community college for a year. So it was like almost 2 years after that initial conversation that I was actually going to Hofstra. And when I first met Bruce and everyone else that was there, it was that belief. It was that they had a plan for you because they believed in you, and that's something that I'll never forget from my early days of Hofstra and WRHU for sure.
Wow, very cool. I have so many questions. I'm going to try to limit them, but I got a couple more on this. So, did you mention that you were transferring into Hofstra from another school? This wasn't straight out of high school, is that right?
So yeah, when I first went to visit Hofstra, um I was in high school,
Mm,
and I wanted to go to Hofstra so badly that my parents told me, if you want to go to Hofstra and a private school,
hmm.
and no, I have three older siblings, none of them, they all went to state schools. They were like, you have to go to community college for 1 year. And that's what I did. I applied to Hofstra right away, and when I got in, I deferred my acceptance. Um, but it was all because I knew I wanted to go there. I was
Yeah.
willing to do whatever it took to go there for 1 year or 2 years, or luckily I got to spend 3 years of college at Hofstra. But that's kind of where why I transferred in was, it was more so, it was what I had to do to go there. And
Got
I
it.
was willing to do whatever it took to go to Hofstra.
Got it. And so you had radio in mind as a major, or broadcasting or journalism? What did you want to study?
I definitely wanted to do, at first I thought I wanted to do audio production, and then again, conversations with Ed and some professors, I went in and did broadcast journalism.
Hmm.
I wanted to take the journalism route in learning instead of just the audio production side of it. Because when I went to school, I actually thought I wanted to be on air.
Mm.
And we can, I can get to that story of like learning that on air wasn't necessarily for me, and that I really wanted to be a producer in the end. But at first, I wanted to be on air, and the better path to getting on air was to take the broadcast journalism route. So that was my major, and then at the time I was at Hofstra, you had a minor in something, and so I minored in psychology, mainly just because I had credits that I could apply from community college to
Right.
a minor in psychology. So that was just sort of to make sure all of my credits from community college got transferred in.
Got it. You kind of hinted at this too before in your story, and there's a little bit of magic in your voice when Kevin gave you that tour and said, "This is what the station's about. This is what you want to be here for." Did you have an idea of what a radio station or a college radio station would look like before that tour?
I My sisters went to Oswego State,
Hmm.
and so they showed me the college radio station there, and that's a for a state school probably the best uh, broadcasting and especially sports broadcasting program. Steve Levy from ESPN went there, and Linda Cohn from SportsCenter went there. So I had always thought that I wanted to go there. And when they showed me the radio station at Oswego, and then I saw the radio station at Hofstra, it was such a big difference. And
Hmm.
so those are the only two real examples I had of college radio stations. And when you see, the difference in the two, it really, really impacts your decision. So that was a big part of why I wanted to go to Hofstra because you walk in and just the facilities. I always say like they have the best facilities for any radio station on Long Island and some of the best in all of New York, and they're a college radio station. So, the facilities are definitely a big reason why I went there.
Wow, wow, that's so cool. All right, thank you for indulging me all those questions there. That was a lot of fun for me. But I want to know about your announcing and engineering classes. You get into the station and you sign up. Did you know what the training classes were like, and what do you remember from that experience?
Yeah, I remember that going into it that there would be a training class. I knew most of my first semester was going to be part of the training class. I knew I had to do an interview with Bruce Avery, and I remember this vividly because I set my alarm for like 3 hours before I had to be at my interview. My interview I think was at like 10, and I set my alarm for 7. And in college, your roommates don't really want to hear your alarm going off at 7. And my roommate turned my alarm off, and I didn't hear it. And I ended up sleeping till like 9:30,
Oh no.
and running across campus to get there in time for my interview with Bruce. Luckily, I was prepared already for it. I knew going into it kind of what some of the questions would be, and so that was my first experience with the training class. Was I remember the interview, and then like 5 days of waiting and waiting and waiting to find out if you're in the training class. And like I said, I'm already coming in as a sophomore, so if I don't get into that first training class, then you're looking at your sophomore year, second semester, and there was just a lot of pressure. It felt like to get into the training class. So I remember putting a lot of effort into that interview. I remember the call of Bruce calling to tell me that I was in the training class, and then I remember the training class, and obviously everybody talks about the Bruce "I like to sleep" night speech.
Hmm.
Vividly remember that. I actually used that speech recently in a new role I have at ESPN, where I'm overseeing all of weekend programming. So from 7 a.m. Saturday morning until midnight Sunday night, if something goes wrong, like my phone is the first that rings.
Oh
And
wow.
so I remember saying to one of the younger producers recently, like, "Hey, like make sure everything's buttoned up with this host connecting from this studio because I've been here since 6 a.m. and I really want to go to bed tonight." And I'm like, wow, that sounded a lot like Bruce Avery's "I like to sleep" night speech.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great, ear catching way to introduce yourself, but it's true. It's really true. And when you're first there, you're like, what is this guy talking about? But once you get into the station, you understand that it's a real thing, and it's a real warning to be prepared and to take it seriously. So I love that it comes back, and I'm glad you thought of him in that moment. So you get through the training class and you pass. Do you remember getting on the air the first time, whether it was the Oasis or doing a sports broadcast? What were your feelings as you were getting on the air?
So I remember the clearing when you had to get cleared for air. Um, I remember it because as soon as I started reading the script that Ed had put in front of me, I had a coughing fit,
Oh no.
and I was like, "Oh my God, I may not be able to be on air." Like I just couldn't stop coughing, And so Ed runs, gets me a glass of water, hands me a Ricola because that's the only brand of cough drop Ed ever knew, and take a deep breath, and then finally, I kind of gathered myself a little bit and was able to finally do the script that was in front of me, and he cleared me for air right then and there, and then from there, I remember doing the Oasis, and then I remember my first game because I was like 2 months out of the training class, and somebody couldn't go on a trip to Towson, Maryland, to call a women's basketball game. And so they asked me right out of the training class. I had never done anything on air for the sports department before, and they were like, "Hey, we think you'd be good at this. We're gonna send you to Towson." This guy, Chris Babos, who was on the staff already, was going to do play by play. It was the first time he was ever going to do play by play, and it was the first time I was ever going to do color. And they sent us down to Towson. That was probably February of 2005, and I had just gotten out of the training class in November of 2004. So it was very quick that I got on air with a game. I remember that. And then I remember doing games all throughout the spring, no matter what sport it was. Women's lacrosse, I did a lot of early on. And then, the locker room and hosting that and doing updates for that. I remember all of that kind of coming in the next few months.
Wow. So that first game where you go down with Chris to Towson, like what were you thinking? Like were you worried about the game broadcast? Were you worried about the technical aspects? What was going through your mind as you're getting set? Because that's a big pool to jump into right there. The both of you guys going in there and do that. I'm nervous for you, and it's many years later, but what was that like?
The big thing I remember was make sure you're prepared.
Yeah.
And a lot of people get to be around the sports department for a while before they do a game, so they get to learn the teams. And I remember getting a crash course just in the women's basketball team. Here are the best players. Here's what you need to look for. The coach was Felicia Leggett Jack at the time, and I remember we had to go interview her before the game. So I remember making sure I was as prepared as possible. And I remember early on when I got on air, I would have a tendency of just making a general comment about something without specifics. And like, I remember in that game trying to avoid general comments and sounding like I was prepared and sounding like I knew what I was doing on the air and knew about the team. The people listening to that game, people listening to a women's basketball game from Towson on a Thursday night in the middle of February, they know the team really well. And I wanted to make sure that I came across as knowing the team as well as they did. So I remember that was the big thing. And that's what I was probably most nervous about was make sure you're as prepared as possible for this team because you haven't been following it all year like everybody else.
Yeah. You mentioned that the tendency you had to make sort of general comments about the flow of the game and not necessarily particular details. Were you doing practice games? Like, how were you training? How did you know that that was something that you needed to work on, given that it was, the beginning of your broadcast career?
Yeah, so Greg Rice, who's gone on to probably the closest friend I have from Hofstra, still talk to him, all the time. He had noticed it in just little things that I had done, whether it was like a newsline update here or an update on the locker room, or we would do. I remember maybe some mock locker rooms like that I would do as like an update just to show that I was ready for on air. And he had noticed that in being on air, and we would do postmortems after shows and after mock things, and he had pointed that out to me at the time, and so that was just something that I remember was in the back of my mind about something that other people had noticed that were around me, and that's one thing I really appreciated about the locker room and the sports department. Everybody was trying to help everybody get better. And we would provide feedback to each other. And it wasn't like, oh, I'm better than you, so I'm going to offer this feedback. It was genuinely people trying to help you get better. And so I remember Greg pointing that out to me. And so it was just sort of in the back of my mind as I went into a lot of my on air broadcasts was don't be the guy who just gives general statements, sound prepared, and give specifics and details.
That's so interesting because I think for most beginner broadcasters, that's an easy trap to fall into. When you're watching a game just to watch it, you're thinking and you're listening to the broadcasters and going, well, I could do better or be more specific. But to learn that, and that Greg and other people were paying attention enough uh, and thoughtful enough to give you that advice in a way that was productive and not, to make you feel bad about it. That it was, this is what you need to do to improve as you're getting started, and that will put you on a higher level so that you can hone your craft more. I think that's an amazing testimony and testament to the sports department as a crew. And I wonder how much of that comes from the general, like, I think we've used the phrase friendly competitiveness among members of the sports department, or is that coming from Bruce and John and Ed, or is it some combination of it?
I think it came from Ed.
Mm,
I really like when you, as we talked about, early on, when you see the way Ed talks to people and cares about people, that trickled down throughout the entire, not just the sports department, but the news department and the whole station. When you have somebody like that at the top who has broadcasted the biggest of games, including the Super Bowl, really caring about every individual person in WRHU,
mm,
it trickles down. It has an impact, and so I think it starts with Ed, and obviously Bruce was a big proponent of feedback and helping people improve and grow. And I think when you get into management roles like, Jared Greenberg was when I first started as the sports director, and then Pete McCarthy right after that, they took the same approach, and it was all about how do we help each other grow and get
wow. Wow, that's very cool. You've mentioned some world class names there, and Jared, and Greg, and a couple just flew out of my mind. But you've got some good people giving you advice and sort of people to look up to. Who else was around? Who else were you working with? Do you remember anybody from your training class, like who you graduated with from there? Who else was around at the station that helped you get settled there?
better. Andrew Falzone was a
Hmm.
huge, was very big for me at the beginning. I remember in the training class getting invited by Andrew to a Hofstra club hockey game, and just going out with him and just seeing someone who is a senior interact with people who are just getting started, and again that genuine care for your career and what you can do at Hofstra. One thing that Andrew taught me was there's more than just the sports department
Hmm.
to WRHU. I knew when I went into it, I wanted to do sports, and that was kind of all I wanted to do was sports, sports, sports. And he told me about like what he got to cover when he got to cover um, the national convention in New York,
Mm-hmm.
and just those types of events. And because of that, two of my favorite memories at Hofstra are not even sports related. Like I loved my time on the sports staff and calling games, and it was great. But two of my favorite memories were election night in 2005. I was the on-site engineer at Mayor Bloomberg's campaign headquarters, and I was there when they announced that he won, and he gave his speech. And then in 2006, a year after, I was one of the rotating board ops for our election night coverage for the midterms. And so it was Andrew who really showed me early on that there was more than just sports at RHU, and for that, I'm really grateful that he did because I got to experience some really cool things in my 3 years there because of that.
Yeah, Andrew's a great guy and a great mentor to so many people. I've talked to so many people who were really well influenced by him. And I guess I want to try to draw a parallel, if you don't mind, between working in the sports world, because you said that was your focus, but then being pulled into news and doing these live events, doing a mayoral election and the midterms. Did you see parallels at the time between sports and news, or did you see them as different entities?
That's a great question because it was one of those things where there was some animosity between the two, or friction, I guess would be a better word,
Hmm.
between the
Hmm.
two sides. Um, so it there was, yeah. So for me, it was Andrew was really a big proponent and kind of bringing the two together. And then I'll give a lot of credit to Pete McCarthy when he took over as sports director. He was very, very big on, hey, we're not going to be the sports department that, kind of bickers with the rest of the WRHU. We're gonna do it differently. And those are two people, Andrew and Pete, that really had a huge impact on kind of making sure that the sports department worked hand in hand with the rest of the station, because I'm not sure that it was that way before I got there. And just from stories I've heard and just sort of what I saw early on. But I think that was a huge part of Andrew and again Pete kind of wanting a different mindset for the department.
Yeah, I think in talking to people over the generations, it's cyclical that the sports department sort of becomes an entity unto its own, and they get a little, I don't know, territorial or, like you said, adversarial. There's some friction, and then a couple of people go through that and go, well, we don't have to be that way. We can hang out with the music people. We can hang out with the rock show or the metal show or whatever it might be. We can hang out with the news people, and then that goes for a couple of years, and then it kind of swings back. So I guess from the time that you got there, Andrew and Pete and those guys were making an effort, I assume, as you were getting started there, to bring everybody together. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's a great way to say it.
Cool. So you mentioned that you did Newsline, you did some music shows, but primarily sports. How did you get brought into the Newsline and the morning show situations?
So we had to do, as part of being on the sports department, you had to do either Newsline or the morning show.
Hmm.
And my big thing at Hofstra was I wanted to try everything. So I did a little bit of Newsline, and then I enjoyed the morning wake up call a lot more. I enjoyed the conversation. I enjoyed being part of, that a little looser, not so much just giving a sports update, but having a conversation about sports, which is what I always kind of knew I wanted to do a little bit more of if I was on air.
Hmm.
Um, and so that's kind of how I got into that mix. And then with the wake up call, I had a group of people that I just really enjoyed doing it with. And one name I have to bring up is Laura McDonald, who kind of was the lead host of the morning show at the time that I did it. And she would always try to say something on air to get me in trouble. She would try to bring me into the conversation, and to have it be something that she knew I would say something that would probably end up in Bruce's office. So I really just enjoyed working with people like that who wanted to have fun on the radio and didn't take it too seriously. And so that's how I got involved in Newsline. And then, like I said, more toward the Hofstra morning wake up call, and I did that for many years. And then in my career, I actually was a producer in morning drive for 11 years, and I think
Wow.
part of being on that morning wake up call helped me have the discipline to do morning radio, because it's not easy, it's not for everyone, and I think that Hofstra sort of trained me for that type of schedule and that type of show.
Yeah. The morning shows are rough to do, and you have to make sure your roommate doesn't turn off your alarms. So you gotta
Luckily, by
plan
the time
ahead.
I got on air, I had a different roommate, and
Uh-huh.
so I actually roomed with a person from the radio station my junior year, Matt Grice. We lived together, and then my senior year, I lived with another friend of mine who was not part of the radio station, but knew how important it was to me. So luckily, yeah, by the time I started doing the morning show, I'd had a different roommate.
Got it. I'm dying to ask, and I probably shouldn't. You mentioned that Laura would try to get you in trouble on the morning show. Do you have any examples that you feel safe sharing, or should we leave it be?
I think we should leave it be. Yeah, there's one specific example.
Got
20
it.
years later, it probably still would get me in trouble on the air. So yeah, I think we should let it go. If
All
you
right.
want a story of me getting myself in trouble, I'm happy to share that, but
Oh
not
yeah,
the one with Laura.
absolutely. Please do. Yeah.
So I was a little too comfortable on air at times, and again I tried to have fun. It was
Yeah.
college radio. I knew we had to take it seriously, but I also tried to have a lot of fun. And it was my senior year. I was calling a women's basketball game on, it was a Sunday afternoon, and we were at that time it was called the David S. Mack
Hmm.
Exhibition, Sports and Exhibition Center, and I there was the shot clock broke, and I was trying to delay time, and I had done a recap of what had happened in the game, and they're still trying to fix it. And I said, we're in a delay here at the David S. Mack Sports and Exhibition Complex, and we may need to call David S. Mack to make another donation to fix the shot clock.
Oh
We can
no.
call it the David S. Mack shot clock. And of all the things I had said in my career at Hofstra, that was the one that Bruce almost pulled me off air for. And luckily, Ed went to bat for me, and it was the end of my senior year, and I had like 5 broadcasts left in me. And thankfully, Ed went to bat for me because I think Bruce really wanted to pull me from the air and be like, "No, you're kind of done. You can't really take a shot at one of our biggest donors and alumni like that." But at the time, I thought it was it was just funny.
That's it's funny, but also potentially very expensive. So,
Very expensive, yes.
oh my! But I going back to what we were talking about at the beginning, that Ed and Bruce and John, that they'll encourage you and give you guidance, but they're also there to back you up and also to rein you in when you need it. And when we're 20 years old, and we get a little experience under our belt, we think, well, we know what we're doing, and sometimes we step over the line a little bit. So it sounds like it ended okay. No one got too hurt.
Exactly. Yeah, I got to do a couple women's basketball games, including like a great win that they had at South Carolina, who has now become such a juggernaut in women's
Yeah.
college basketball. So like having that, having to be able to, I wouldn't have been able to call that game if they hadn't let me continue on air. And then got to do my final locker room, got to do my final broadcast, which was a softball game. So yeah, all of those memories of doing those final shows kind of would have been taken away because of something stupid I said, in a 30-second trying to kill time as they were fixing the shot clock. So I am grateful to Bruce and to Ed that they gave me that opportunity.
Nice. Nice. Going back to your early days, once you're, going through the training class and getting settled, did you feel comfortable socially at the station right away? Was there a moment where you thought these are my people, or did it take some time?
I felt that way right away.
Mm.
Yeah, I feel like that's one thing about WRHU, especially when I was there. I'm sure it's the same way now because it's a lot of the same people that are in charge. But it was just a very welcoming place to be. I had no interest in pledging a fraternity. I didn't really have any interest in anything other than being a part of the radio station. And one of the reasons was because when I first got there, everybody just was so welcoming, and not just on the sports department, but across the board from people on station manager, program director. Everybody was they were all students and upperclassmen at the time, but yeah, they were all welcoming, and so no, I never felt out of place at the station. I always felt like I was part of something, and you always felt like you were doing something important, and that's a big thing for me is like that feeling of like the things we're doing, the work we're doing, the hard work we're putting into this show on Sunday night for a locker room that's going to run for an hour. It felt important, and that's one of the things I really enjoyed about my time there.
Hmm. Very cool. Um, was there a point in terms of your on-air work or engineering where you felt really comfortable or like you knew what you were doing? Was there a light bulb moment like, oh, this is it, I'm good at this? Or again, was it just sort of gradual and gaining experience and getting reps?
It was producing the locker room. Yeah, the
Hmm.
summer of 2006, I was the producer of the locker room for the entire summer, um, while students were away. And I remember being able to make the show my own. And in the past, one thing we had done in the summer would we would cover all of the other nearby sports, whether it was the Long Island Lizards, the lacrosse team, or the Long Island Ducks, the minor league baseball team. And the New York Juggernauts were a softball team that we had done some work on the previous summer. And my goal that summer was to every week find stories about Hofstra sports that we could cover so we could really be WRHU even in the summer. And
Hmm.
that was a moment where it clicked for me that it was like, okay, I have ideas that are different from others that people are willing to buy into and willing to go to work and execute to make interesting. We would go over to the wrestling offices and interview the wrestling coach in the summer because he was still on campus, or interview the baseball coach one week. And that was my goal. My goal going into the summer that year was to make sure that we produced all Hofstra sports even in the summer when classes weren't going on. And I was really proud that sort of a plan that I had was executed, and not just that, not just for me, but that I was able to get other people on the staff to kind of buy into my vision, and that was a really big light bulb moment for me. And it's one of the reasons that I went into production instead of on air. Was kind of, I had that control. I Being on air, you don't have a lot of control once you're on air. Everything is just kind of happening around you. When you're a producer, you're in control of a lot of different things, and I enjoyed that. Not from an ego standpoint, but just from a, I liked controlling the content.
Hmm.
And so yeah, that summer of 2006 is probably the reason that I became a talk show producer and didn't try to go on air.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I was sort of thinking that some of your big moments seem to be as a producer or as an engineer, whether it's election coverage or sports. But then you've also got these moments that you really clearly still cherish to this day, where you were on air calling games or doing these reports. Was there a push and pull in your interest as you were there, or was there a moment where you thought, I'm going to go in this direction, or maybe I'll stay, over here and keep in this lane?
So my senior year, I tried to do more on-air stuff because I knew in once I graduated, I was going to be a producer. I'd kind of, like I said, that summer of 2006, going into my senior year, I had kind of made the decision that I wanted to be a producer. And
Hmm.
so I took all of the on-air opportunities I could my senior year. I went to Alaska with the men's basketball team for the Great Alaska Shootout.
Wow.
I, I called the women's basketball tournament and all their postseason games. So it once I made the decision to pursue the career as a producer, I actually did more on air because I knew it might be the last chance I ever had, and I wanted to get those moments and those opportunities. Um, but early on, I kind of tried everything to see what I wanted to do once I graduated, and then I'm glad I did because I think when I first got to Hofstra, like a lot of people, you think you're going to be on air, you think you're going to be the next Sam Rosen, the voice of the New York Rangers, or John Sterling, the former voice of the Yankees. That's what you think you're going to do. And
Hmm.
then you try all these new things and you realize that there's more to broadcasting than just being on the air. And so early on, those opportunities to do a little bit of everything, including producing shows, made me realize that I wanted to be a producer. And then once I made that decision, I kind of just did on air for fun and took as many of those opportunities as I could before my time at Hofstra ran out.
Hmm. Do you think your on-air work, especially that stuff as a senior, when you're just like you said doing it for fun, does that experience help inform your work now or later as a producer, as behind the scenes? Is that helpful?
Yeah, for sure. One of the things, and I brought up earlier, the idea of the feedback that we provided each other is one thing to this day that I still do. I still provide my hosts feedback on how we can improve as a full show. How producers who I work with, who are younger than me, who are working under me, at this point, like how giving them feedback on how they can improve. All of that was stuff I learned at Hofstra, and so I'm really proud that I've taken those examples and kind of that experience and applied it now that I'm working, at ESPN Radio.
Mm,
Um, but I also think that I have a little bit of an awareness to how difficult it is to be on air, and I think that comes through a lot of the time in my feedback as well. As I'm not trying to talk to my hosts as if what they're doing is easy. And I think
hmm.
because I did it at Hofstra and I know how hard it is to be on air, I think it helped me when I got into the producing because I think I have sort of that sensitivity a little bit that what they're doing on air is really hard.
Yeah, yeah, it's a definite skill, and it takes a ton of practice, and seeing both sides of it behind the microphone and behind the scenes is especially useful. And I want to kind of call back to, you know, you had Hofstra in mind, you had the radio station in mind when you first showed up as a sophomore, and you knew Ed and you knew Kevin. But at that time, when you were getting settled in your first year at Hofstra, what did you think Hofstra Radio would mean to you in those early days, and what did it become?
It it became everything. Like I'm not where I am today without Hofstra Radio. There's no question that those 3 years allowed me to learn so much that I watch people learn when they first get into the industry. And because I had that jump start when I, took my first job part time at SiriusXM, I was able to do a lot more than what maybe some of the other part timers were able to do because they were just learning it, and I had 3 years of experience. So I understand and appreciate what Hofstra has become and Hofstra Radio has become in my life. It's kind of defined who I am in a good way, in a way of like, if it wasn't for that experience, I don't know where I would be in my career. Going into it, I knew it would just be something that would be really important. I didn't know how important, and I didn't know the level of influence it would have on the rest of my career. But when you first walk through those doors, you understand that that's a big place. That's a really important part of Hofstra. The fact that, like I mentioned earlier, that we're doing the games as students, and that we don't have a commercial radio station, that there's a reason for that, and the reason is because WRHU is such a juggernaut.
Hmm.
And so it's really become, at the time I knew it was something big, and it's just become a really an important part of my life. And I'm still proud to this day when I see, a WRHU student broadcasting from a big event, or when I see WRHU receive a national award. Because when I got there, that wasn't part of WRHU. Like, they weren't Marconi winning. They weren't, recognized as one of the biggest radio stations for college in the country. That went to Ithaca and Syracuse and Fordham. And so I'm really proud of what the station has become because it's finally getting the recognition that I thought it always deserved.
Hmm. Wow. Um, this has been so much fun. I've enjoyed every second of this so much, and I'm grateful that you took the time to share your stories. I'm hopeful that you have some more stories because I have more questions, and I would love to do this again sometime.
Absolutely, Brian. Reach out anytime. This is a lot of fun. I look forward to doing it again.